Glad that we can have some new folks join us. This is actually our third session of this How to Read the Bible series, and it's a topic I'm really excited about, and just have continued to grow my passion in this area, and especially over the last few weeks, and had a lot of great questions and discussion and stuff happening during the group. So thank you all for that. Makes my job easier when I feel like you guys are interested in it. So just to kind of recap a little bit, because I know that last week we had some crazy weather and not everybody was able to come out. You can catch up online on our YouTube page. You can find all of these sessions as well, including tonight. And some people are actually joining us online live for these things on Wednesday nights as well, which is pretty cool. But just to kind of recap last time, so the first session we just kind of had an intro. Last session we talked specifically about narrative in the Bible, and narrative just being basically the author's trying to communicate a story that includes things like characters that exist in a setting and are traveling through some sort of plot sequence. You know, that fourth grade English plot sequence diagram where you have conflict and climax and resolution, all those things. We kind of talked about those things, and then broke down into basically three main levels of plot that exists in the biblical narrative, and the big one being just that main storyline, that big overarching storyline of the Bible that progresses through the whole of the entire Bible, and sort of climaxes with Jesus. And then we have the resolution after Jesus, after his ascension, and the Gospels. And then the epistles and stuff sort of are what church life looks like and all that. That's kind of the resolution of the whole of the Bible. And then the second level is sort of these big movements. So these are bigger chunks of the Bible. Like we talked about Genesis 1 through 11 being one big movement that sort of sets up the story of God with the whole world. And then Genesis 12 starts a new movement of the patriarchs, the covenant people of God. And there's a few other big movements, and there's sort of, within those big movements, you have their own individual plot sequence that sort of underlies the main plot sequence of the whole Bible. And then you get, within those movements, you get hundreds of little bitty mini stories that also have their own plot sequence, but they fit into the movement, which fits into the bigger one. So the whole idea of this is, the whole story points to Jesus, and it's the fulfillment in Jesus. And it's really cool once you start to pick up on what we also defined last time as design patterns. So you get to see these repeating themes that pop up throughout the big narrative storyline of the Bible, and they really help. There's sort of, a lot of them are established in the first 3 or 4 chapters of Genesis, and then they develop each other and they develop forward and then also develop backwards, and they're sort of constantly reflecting upon one another. And it's really cool once you start to pick up on those design patterns, because you can see, we talked last time about kind of chaotic water was one of those things. And chaotic waters are from the very first chapter of the Bible, right? And then that story sort of develops as in Exodus, they go through the chaotic waters, and God's constantly delivering people through the waters, and then sort of culminates with Jesus' baptism, where he goes down under the waters and comes back up, and sort of symbolizes a lot of that defeating of chaos in the person of Jesus. So anyways, that's kind of what we really honed in on last time, just talking about the narrative arc of the Bible, and then looked at a couple of individual stories as well. This session, we're going to look at poetry, which sort of scares me a little bit because I'm not a poet. I'm not really artistic at all. But we're gonna break it down in a way that I think is going to be helpful. And it's definitely been helpful for me reflecting on biblical poetry in a different light through some of these topics. So guess what? The month of April just so happens to be National Poetry Month. So it's very appropriate that we're going to talk about poetry in our first session in April. So I want to just kick it off with a poem that is by a guy named Billy Collins. And he actually was, back in the day, when September 11th, when 9/11 happened, he was the poet laureate for the United States. I didn't even know that we had a poet laureate over the whole U.S. But anyways, he wrote a poem reflecting on 9/11, but that's not this poem. It's actually a really beautiful poem. I did a little research on him, but he's a professor currently still, a professor of poetry, poetic studies. And this introduction to poetry was really his intention behind it was to get his students to just fall in love and have a passion for poetry. And his poetry is really witty and kind of funny. You're going to see that as we read. So here it is, Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name from the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So I think that really kind of sums up my journey with poetry. Like, what am I reading? What does this mean? And I mean, I feel like that really sort of sets it up, right? I mean, when I don't know if you guys experience this with biblical poetry. I mean, really, poetic language is all throughout even narrative in the Bible as well. So, I mean, it's really sometimes very difficult to read and pick out what the meaning is. But what poetry really is not trying to do is be narrative. So it is not narrative. So the intention or the main goal of poetry is not to convey information or to provide a reader with a timeline of events. So poetry really, the definition of poetry based on Encyclopedia Britannica online is a kind of literature that evokes a concentrated, imaginative awareness of one's experience or emotions by means of a well-crafted language that's chosen for its meaning, sound, and rhythm. So, I mean, right? We're used to reading poetry that rhymes, that has like a cadence to it, and in English poetry, anyways, rhyming words is like, you know, the end of this line will rhyme with the end of this line in some way, shape, or form, right? It might not be a perfect rhyme, but it makes sense in our brains, and we kind of see, oh yeah, I see how those match together. You know, roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you, right? So it's rhyming blue and you, and it's tying those lines together in some way and building on the meaning of that, because people are sweet in a much different way than sugar is, right? Unless you like to eat people. That would just be weird. Okay, sorry, I digress. But poetic language is dense. It's packed full of meaning in much smaller bits of words, in much smaller or much fewer words. You get a lot more meaning packed in there. And it really invites the reader into an experience more than a story or informational or trying to convey information. So it provokes an emotional response in the reader, and really it can shape how we feel and how we think about the world if we allow it to do that. If you really try to get into it and allow it to do what it's designed to do, which is to provoke those emotions and really shape how you feel and how you think. So there's a few features of poetry, and I'm not going to read all these definitions, but well, I guess I have to, because I didn't give you guys the words, did I? So, okay. So the first bullet point is the line, and this is the smallest segment of poetry, and it consists of dense, complete statements. So most of the time when you look at a poem, just like when we looked at the introduction to poetry, a line is going to be literally one line, right? It's divided up into these different segments. So you have the line, then you have the verse, which is a succession of words arranged according to the natural or artificial rules that are designed by the poet. And then you have meter, which is the cadence or rhythm of the words, and then rhyme is the correspondence to a sound between the words or the endings of words. And then imagery, And this is a really big one because this is one of the key things that biblical poets are using and playing on. And imagery is a literary device that refers to the use of figurative language to evoke a sensory experience or create a picture with words for the reader. And this is a big thing for poetry, right? Like that's the whole reason that poetry really exists, is to paint a picture in our mind. So we're actually envisioning what we're reading on the page. Whereas narrative, we're looking for information or meaning or whatever. Or if it's prose discourse is another thing we're actually going to try to talk about tonight. We'll see if we get there. But that's an argument, right? I'm presenting an argument to you. So there's logic involved with that, whereas poetry is literally just trying to get you to imagine imagine the imagination of the poet, so to speak. So the different types of imagery that can be used by a poet, and all of these do exist in biblical poetry as well. Symbolism is, like think of like a wedding ring is a symbol of marriage, right? Like it's an object that carries with it meaning for a certain group of people. Might be different based on your context or whatever, but it's some object that represents something or has specific meaning. Metaphor is comparing two things, but it's implicit in the language. It's not explicitly stated. So a metaphor differs from simile in that way. A simile is, I use like or as to compare two things. I might say my wife is spicy. My wife is very fiery, and she is that, but I don't necessarily mean that, right? But then I could also say my wife is like some spicy dish of food or something like that, and that would be the difference. Oh, I love you, baby. She knows she's spicy. But anyways, simile and metaphor are very similar, but it's just the way that it's framed. Metaphor is a little bit more like I'm committing to this a little bit more, whereas simile is a little less. It sort of takes a step back from that, I suppose. And then these other two, I'm going to butcher it, but it's synecdoche, I think is how you say that one. And this is where a part of something is made to represent the whole, or the whole is made to represent the part of something. So you might say there's a lot of really amazing movies that come from Hollywood, but Hollywood's a place, right? The movies come out of a studio that might be in Hollywood, but we're using Hollywood to represent the whole of the movie creation, right? And then another version of that might be, I'm sorry, I messed that up. That's metonymy, Hollywood. Yes, okay. Am I misreading this? No, I'm not. Okay, doesn't matter. So the whole representing the part, you have a really nice, I really like your wheels. I'm not talking about the wheels on your car, I'm talking about your whole car, right? And then metonymy is the Hollywood example. I'm sorry, I misspoke there. Trying to do it from memory when I have a paper right in front of me. Come on, y'all. Where's Jen to throw something at me? That's what she's supposed to do. Anyways, okay, so those are some features of just poetry in general, but some of those same things are going to be used in biblical poetry as well. But there's a few additional things that biblical poetry might do differently. And it's also, you have to consider that we're within the context of ancient Hebrew culture whenever we're reading biblical poetry, right? So one of the big things that they use in biblical poetry is called couplets. So this is where two short lines are carefully worded and placed beside one another. And then the one line will introduce the idea, and then the next line will develop it in some way. It either completes it, or it deepens it, or it contrasts it in some way. So one line will introduce it, and the next line will further develop it. And then another thing that's pretty unique to biblical poetry is parallelism. And this is the correspondence of one verse or line with another. And this really causes the reader to place two or more things in comparison with each other so that their uniqueness and meaning becomes more visible through that comparison. Does that make sense? So there's a really, really wide diversity of this. So we're going to go through a few examples of that in just a little bit. But really, the point of this, of me telling you all this, is there's a lot involved here, and it's not just easy to just read it and get it, right? It takes work. You have to read it and reread it, and you have to be aware that some of these tools are being implemented in order to really dive into it and be like, okay, I see what they're doing here. I see how these two lines are related. And then also these two lines might be related to these other two lines that are 4 verses away. And you start to pick up on those patterns as you read poetry, and there's so many different ways they might rearrange that stuff. But as long as you know that it exists, then you can start to go, it's just like those design patterns. You go, they're talking about crossing chaotic water or God taming the water or whatever. Then you start to see those patterns in poetry just as you do in narrative. So I want to take a moment and just look back to back if we look at some narrative, and then because most of biblical poetry is going to be a reflection of something that's happened in the narrative at some point. It's not going to introduce new information because that's not the point of it, right? It's the point is to reflect on it and bring more meaning to what it's reflecting on. So I want to compare 2 chapters that are literally back to back in the Exodus story. So it's the crossing of the Red Sea. So I don't know if I included this in your packet or not. If I did, it might be in the back. But if we look at Exodus chapter 14 and verse 21, it says, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land so that the waters were divided. And the sons of Israel went through in the midst of the sea on the dry land, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left." And then verse 26, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may come back over the Egyptians.'" Because the Egyptians were pursuing them through the water at this point, right? "Over the Egyptians and over their chariots and their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal state at daybreak while the Egyptians were fleeing right into it. Then the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered their chariots and the horsemen. Even Pharaoh's entire army had gone into the sea after them. Not even one of them remained. But the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. That's pretty epic, right? I mean, you can envision what's happening there when Moses is stretching out. I mean, it's been portrayed in movies and in Bible shows and all that sort of stuff, and cartoons, and the Prince of Egypt. It's pretty epic when that happens, and it's pretty cool. But let's take a look at Exodus 15. So this is actually immediately after this story. Then Moses reflects back on it, and he writes a song to reflect on it. And songs are poetry, if you didn't know that, says the songwriter. Pastor John's a really great poet, by the way. I'll have to share the song that he wrote for my daughter, Lucy. It's really, really sweet. So Exodus 15 and 1, "I will sing a song to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will extol him. The Lord is a warrior, the Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he casts into the sea, and the choicest of his officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deeps cover them, they went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, is majestic in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. And in the greatness of your excellence, you overthrow those who would rise up against you. You send forth your burning anger, and it consumes them like chaff. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters were piled up. The flowing waters stood up like a heap. The deeps were congealed in the heart of the sea." So you get the difference here, right? I mean, it's like the story is pretty epic, but then what sort of like imagery does the poetry bring to the same story? It really just elaborates on it. It like the blast of your nostrils versus just a wind blew across the sea, The waters congealed versus just standing up, and it's these rushing, chaotic waters are congealed in the depths versus the water stood up like a wall. It's just, the narrative is a little bit more like clinical and matter of fact, right? Whereas you talk about the poetry brings in a little bit more the imagery. And it's really, really beautiful. So that's a sort of side-by-side example, but literally you look through the Psalms and it basically goes back over the whole of the Hebrew Bible in reflection poetry. So you can start to recognize this the more and more that you get into these poems and really start to appreciate how much David was riffing off of everything that had happened in his own life. He does that as well, but also throughout the whole narrative of the nation of Israel, the whole history of the nation is reflected upon in those lines. So, sorry, I'm not a poet, I'm not an artist, so you're gonna have to hear me read some more. But hopefully, some of these next examples I want to look at are gonna show you exactly how the structure of the poetry works and how they might complement each other. So that way you can start to pick up on some of the patterns that you would look for to bring more light to what the authors are really trying to do with these things. So some of the parallel relationships that exist, you have like comparison analogy, and this is the corresponding words and images that stimulate an imaginative reflection on shared metaphorical attributes of the paired items. So things are paired together, and this is actually showing how they're similar, right? And then you have contrast, which sets up those two different things again, but now we're reflecting on the differences of those two things versus how they're similar. And then complement is sort of like what we talked about earlier. The first line will complete the thought or image, or it might heighten that point in some way. Okay? So now we're going to look at some of the different ways that symmetry and some of this parallelism might work in poetry. So do you guys have in your packet, you have Psalm 137, verse 5 through 6? Okay, cool. So what you're going to notice here is the A, B, B, A. So these are the A's will be the lines that you're meant to link together in your mind. And then the B's you're meant to link together as well. And sometimes they'll throw a C in there also, but I don't know if I gave you any examples with the C. Maybe I did. Okay, so the first one, this is an example of what they call reverse symmetry or chiasm in Psalm 137, verse 5 through 6. So, if I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I don't remember you. So you get it, A and A. If I forget you, if I don't remember you, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate. So that's debilitating stuff, right? I'm not going to be able to speak. I'm not going to be able to use my hand. But if I forget Jerusalem, those things are going to happen. So they mirror each other, right? And then in Psalm 33, this is an example of what they call forward symmetry. So line A, Yahweh frustrated the plans of the nations. He reduces to nothing the schemes of the peoples. Yahweh's plan endures forever, the schemes of his heart from generation to generation. So this is a little bit different because the first A line is talking about the nation's plans. The second A line is talking about Yahweh's plans, but they still mirror each other, right? Because Yahweh is the key figure there. He's frustrating the plans of the nations, and his plans endures forever. And then the B lines, he reduces to nothing the schemes of the people, but the schemes of his heart endure from generation to generation. So again, they're mirror, but they're not necessarily complementing each other in this example, right? All right, and then complex reverse symmetry. Love the Lord, all you his godly ones. The Lord preserves the faithful and fully recompenses the proud. Be strong and let your heart take courage, all you who hope in the Lord. So you can see again the A, B, C, C, A, B. You can see how those A lines match, the B lines match, and then the C lines match, right? So these are just examples of how those different parallel lines are going to be reorganized in a whole bunch of different ways, but you can pick up on the themes in the individual lines and whether they're complementing each other or contrasting each other or whatever. This is how biblical poetry works, and it's maddening sometimes, at least to me. Do you guys see what I'm talking about, though? Is it good? Okay. And it's because this took me a little while to get. Like I had to go back and rewatch this lesson from the course when they were talking about all these different conventions that they're using in biblical poetry, because it was just so. So I tried to pick out the examples that sort of made sense to me, and then bring them to you all. So, okay. So I want to look at one more example, and sorry, we're going to look at Psalm 29. Does anybody else want to read Psalm 29? I would love for you to if you want, because I know that my poetic voice is not very poetic, but it's okay if you don't want to, but no volunteers. Okay, cool. Angela? Angela, you have a very wonderful speaking voice. I'm just kidding. I'll read it. That's all right. If you want to, you can. I did. Okay, all right. Angela's going to read. A reading by Angela Pileggi from Psalm 29.
Give to Yahweh, O sons of God. Give to Yahweh glory and strength. Give to Yahweh the glory due his name. Worship Yahweh in the majesty of his holiness. The voice of Yahweh is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. Yahweh over the mighty waters. The voice of Yahweh is powerful. The voice of Yahweh is majestic. The voice of Yahweh breaks the cedars. Yahweh breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon leap like a calf, Mount Sirion like a wild young ox. The voice of Yahweh strikes with flashes of fire. The voice of Yahweh shakes the desert. Yahweh shakes the desert of Kadesh. The voice of Yahweh shakes apart the oaks and strips the forests bare. And in his temple, everything shouts glory. Yahweh sits enthroned over the flood. Yahweh is enthroned as King eternal. Yahweh gives strength to his people. Yahweh blesses his people with peace. Awesome.
Much more calming voice than me. Oh, is this a poetry thing that you do? Oh, okay. See? This is how knowledgeable I am about poetry. I didn't even know that. So do you kind of pick up on some of those conventions that we're talking about in this poem? I really like this one because it's super repetitive in nature in terms of the sort of key subject of each of the lines, right? So and actually the Hebrew word for voice is kol, Q-O-L, kol, and it can mean voice if we're talking about like a personal sound, or if we're talking about like the sound of a storm, it could mean just thunder. So the fact that they chose that word, and that word is so repeated throughout this entire poem, what do you think the poet is reflecting on in this poem? Does anybody have an idea? What does it remind you of? What imagery comes to your mind whenever you see it or hear it? There's not a wrong answer. A storm. Yeah, that's exactly what I envision when I hear of this, right? But and it's important also, as we pointed out last week, if there's a mention of a place, that it's probably significant to the author and to the Israelites, the Hebrew people, right? So we're talking about Lebanon and Mount Sirion and the cedars of Lebanon, and so what we're meant to sort of envision here is the poet is standing on the seashore or standing somewhere on dry land, and he's seeing a thunderstorm out over the waters, and it's moving, and the fact that they're sharing all these different places with us is like the storm moves inward, and then it goes, over the cedars of Lebanon. It goes over the mountains, and then moves down to the desert and all this. So like, if I could have a map up here, you would see the different locations on the map, and it's really meant to talk about Yahweh's presence within a thunderstorm, but also across the entire land, right? And when the voice of Yahweh is powerful, the voice of Yahweh is majestic, the voice of Yahweh breaks the cedars. It's his voice, his presence, Yahweh is powerful. So in those first three lines, we're looking verses 4 and 5, the voice of Yahweh is what's acting, right? And then in that fourth line, Yahweh is acting, and he's breaking into pieces the cedars of Lebanon, which I don't know if you've ever seen a cedar tree before. I've never been to Lebanon, but I've seen cedars, and they're massive trees, right? So this is meant to be like, Yahweh is so powerful that he's breaking apart something that is massive and super tall and super broad, and it's very sturdy, right? So you can see that idea just develop just in those few lines. And then the next verse, verse 6, he makes Lebanon leap like a calf. And there's a mountain range in Lebanon. So now we're not talking about massive trees. We're talking about mountains that leap like a calf. And then Mount Sirion is the largest mountain in the whole region of Israel. And now, okay, so the Lebanon mountains are leaping, but now Mount Sirion is leaping. And not like a calf, but like a wild ox. And apparently these wild oxen were like just the mass, like the size of like a mini short bus school, like just massive creatures, right? So the whole point here is he's developing the story. He's developing the imagery as we go along. And then you also get, do you guys have the diagram of this? I'm so sorry. This was like, I kind of put this packet together sort of last minute. Is there a diagram that sort of draws lines and connects? There's not. Okay. I'll post that because it's really cool to see the actual diagramming of this entire poem, because it shows the linking together of like the first stanza or the first verse and then the last verse, and it's sort of this reverse image. It's reversal of the order even. So give to Yahweh as sons of God. Give to Yahweh glory and strength. Give to Yahweh glory to his name. Worship Yahweh in majesty of his holiness. And then the final stanza, and in his temple everything shouts glory. Yahweh sits enthroned over the flood. Yahweh is enthroned as King eternal. Yahweh gives strength to his people, and Yahweh blesses his people. So who is giving the strength in the first line, the first stanza there? It's the people, right? So the people are giving glory and strength to Yahweh. But then in the last stanza, it flips, and now it's Yahweh that's giving strength to his people, right? And even the order of it is sort of mirrored in that. So it's really cool if you can actually look at envision the diagram. But anyways, so this is Hebrew poetry, y'all. I mean, I don't know, and this is literally just a reflection of a storm, but like there's reflection on every incident that happens, every major event that happens in the life of the Hebrew people is reflected on in poetry in some spot, whether it's in the Psalms or whether it's in Proverbs or Songs of Solomon or Song of Songs, however you want to say that one. It's just there's just nothing else to it. You just got to just dive in and read it and reread it and understand the whole story, because if you get the context, then you get what they're trying to do through the poetic imagery as well. So there's a few different places, as I said, that you can find poetry, and Psalms is the largest collection. It's just literally all poetry. And then, of course, you have Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, but also all throughout, you're going to see poems sort of just break out of narrative as well. So it might be that they're telling a story like in Exodus, the example that we just did. They're telling the story of coming through the sea and then a song of reflection, right? And the prophetical books do this all the time. There might be a moment where they're in the midst of a speech and of accusation to the nation of Israel, and all of a sudden they break out into poetic speech to bring imagery and to have them reflect on something that happened previously to then invite the Spirit into that to convict them and to bring them out of it, right? So so you have the Psalms, and then you have the prophetical poetry. And really, the prophets, it's interesting, they're the ones who wrote the whole Bible, basically. But they were, in the day that they existed, they were the minority. And a lot of the religious leaders that surrounded them were not very fond of them because they were calling them out on their crap, right? But then when these prophecies and things that they were speaking about came to pass, and they're like, oh my gosh, okay, they're legit. Like, okay, now we need to listen to them. Maybe years after they're dead. So it's maybe too late, but it's never too late because God is timeless, right? So the main idea of prophetical poetry is accusation, repentance, and then this idea of the day of the Lord, which when you look at apocalyptic poetry, and most of the apocalyptic literature in the Bible is going to be in poetic form usually. So we're talking like the major and minor prophets have a lot of that, but also the book of Revelation as well. And it's in poetic form because it's meant to evoke in you this sense of like, oh my gosh, something needs to be done because the day of the Lord is approaching. And there are multiple days of the Lord in the Bible, by the way. It's not just the one. So like every time the nation of Israel goes into exile, that's the day of the Lord when Jerusalem falls. But also in Revelation, the capital T, the day of the Lord, like the primo, the last day of the Lord, is what John is referring to in Revelation. But anyways, I don't want to get into all that because that could be a class probably all on its own. But there's lots of different places where you can find poetry, and the prophets it's really interesting to read through that poetry as well. Okay, I want to talk about discourse, which I have, we can do this in a few minutes. So prose discourse is the other main type of literature, and that's what I talked about. Like it's either like essays or speeches, or it could be legal documentation or legal speech as well. So we'll just talk through the different varieties of that. So biblical law is a big section of it, especially in the Old Testament, because there's literally over 600 different laws that are presented in the Old Testament. And it's not just Deuteronomy and Numbers and that. Like it starts from like page 1 or maybe page 2. Don't eat of that tree, right? That's a divine commandment. Do not eat the fruit of that tree. So it starts in the garden. That's the very first commandment that God gives to his people. But then there's the covenant, which really a covenant is a marriage contract, right? We talked a little bit about this in the narrative section of this class. And it's really just establishing the rules of the marriage, of the partnership. Here's what I'm going to do for you, but here's what you need to do as well, okay? And if you can follow this covenant, then I'm going to bless you. If you don't, I'm going to remove the blessing. So the point of the covenant is not necessarily to have people follow it. I know that sounds weird, but the point of God establishing that covenant is to show Israel, to expose Israel of their inability to follow his rules. And really just, you don't need all these rules. You just need to trust me. You just need to be with me. Lean on my understanding, not your own, right? That's the whole point. But that's not the way it worked out. So he presents these laws, these covenants with them. And there's really like 4 big categories of laws in the covenant. And there's literally 613 of them, but you can, 613, 611? I don't remember. Anyways, over 600, but they fall into like four main buckets, right? And they're the laws of holiness, the laws of sacrifice, and then you have the justice laws, which that's like, criminal civil law, like you did something wrong to me, so here's how we need to make that right. Or I stole something from you and this is how we make that right? Criminal or civil. And then sacred time, or this is like the Sabbath, for instance, would be an example of just sacred time laws. So there's a whole bunch of them, but they all kind of fall into those buckets. And really, as we talked about last time, everything that's in the Old Testament, all these rules and regulations and laws and on holiness, sacrifice, justice, and sacred time, Jesus said that he fulfilled all of it, right? So the culmination, the climax of the whole story is Jesus coming and being like, I'm here, I have done all of this, because he lived the perfect human life. And he took all of the burden of all of that on himself, and then took it to the cross. So, and you know, what did Jesus say was the most important commandment? It's right there in your packet. Love God, love others as yourself, right? That the 2-in-1 commandment. This is the most important commandment. Love God, but also this is just as important. Love others as yourself. So he makes it a lot easier. Well, he makes it a lot more simple, right? It's not easy. It's definitely not easy to love your enemy, love someone that you hate as much as you love yourself. But anyways, so he hones it all into these really 2-in-1 commandment. But anyways, move on. The New Testament epistles, and this is a big chunk of the New Testament, right? There's 21 individual letters that are written to different either individuals or churches, and these are all written by the apostles, the people that directly were in Jesus's inner circle, right? And really, the big thing to understand about these is the context. So I'm going to spend a minute talking about context, and then we might not have time for an example on this. Sorry. I want to leave time for questions. So the 3 levels of historical context. So you have historical context and literary context. But the 3 levels of historical context are storyline context, and this is how these letters fit into the larger story of the scriptures. And then you have cultural context, which the culture in the time that these were written was the Roman Empire, you know, lording over the people of Israel. And there wasn't a lot of stability. If you threatened them or challenged the hierarchy in any way, you were severely punished or crucified. And like, it was not a pleasant time to live as an Israelite, most likely. And also they had this social hierarchy, right? Which to some degree still exists today, though less so. But like, you were not allowed to get together with people that were outside of your social class. So really these letters, the biggest thing about these letters to understand is they were countercultural. They tore down all of those barriers to people getting together and to people having an opinion about things and all that. Like, just broke all of them down. And really that's what they still do for us today. We're called to be countercultural as followers of Jesus. If you believe in everything that he taught, we are meant to not follow suit with everything that's happening around us, right? But it's one of the things I love about the Hills is like you see the counterculture here. Like you see people of different ethnicities and different belief backgrounds and different race, whatever. It's really cool to see a non-denominational church just kind of like meld all that together. So it's, we're really living what a lot of like Paul was talking about in his letters. So anyways, the third level is situational context. And this is where the writers are addressing the specific issues within a specific church or a specific city. So I get the example here is the food laws in the book of Romans. Paul is recognizing that the different followers had a huge cultural difference. They had differences in theological backgrounds and social status, but they were unified in the one thing that brings us all together, which is Jesus. So really the food laws don't matter. He's like, well, if you're hanging out with Jews, then eat kosher. If you're not hanging out with Jews, then you don't have to worry about it. It's like it's just like an elimination of all these rules, because Jesus is calling us all together to work to further the kingdom and to bring the kingdom to the ends of the earth, right? So that's historical context, and then literal context is basically, I mean, the apostles they worked together. It wasn't necessarily just Paul that was writing the Pauline epistles, even though he's the main author and he's the one that's addressing. Silas was probably helping him out with a lot of things, but also they had scribes that helped them to develop the language as well. So all of the apostles were not beautiful poets and amazing speakers, right? I mean, Peter was a fisherman. So there was other people involved in writing, but they were the ones that knew what Jesus was all about, and they had firsthand knowledge of his messages and his day-to-day living and all of that. So they carried that power, his Holy Spirit power that was given them on the day of Pentecost. They carried that with them, and their goal was to spread it to everybody that they came in contact with. So anyways, so the letters were originally designed to actually be heard, just like most of the Hebrew Bible as well. It's meant to be like a speech. They always kind of open. They have like an opening section. They have the main point of the body, and then they have a conclusion. And usually it's going to open with like, hey, it's me, Paul. I'm writing to you because of this. I want to pray for you. I love you. Thank you for this. And then the body is where it's going to really unpack the main argument. And it really is an argument. Most of these letters are set up as, hey, this is what Jesus said. We believe this. He sent us his Spirit. So, oh, by the way, that means that we're supposed to live this way. And because of that, you're supposed to talk to these people this way. You're supposed to do these things, and it's going to lead to this. So there's a logical argument throughout, but it's not just one chapter, right? You have to look, so like the book of Ephesians, I think there's like a intro section of like the first 3 chapters, and then chapter 4 starts out with therefore. Pastor John always says, if you see a therefore, find out what it's there for. And the whole preceding 3 chapters are the context that are setting up that therefore. So a lot of those words that you'll see, therefore, and so, like they'll have a transition that then is introducing the next phase of their argument. And then it all kind of concludes to one neat little point. But it's the whole book that arc happens. It's not just one chapter. So that's where we have to like get out of just reading little snippets of Scripture and read the whole thing in the context that it's designed for. So, okay, good. I want to open it up for questions. We have a few more minutes. So sorry, that was, I felt like that was kind of disorganized in my brain a little bit tonight. So are you guys good? Did that make some sense? And sorry, I'm not a poet, but I'll work on it before next week. Next week, though, I'm actually really excited. We're going to talk about just the Gospels. And we might be able to get through all 4 in one session. The goal is not to read the entirety of each Gospel, but just kind of set it up and sort of read the introduction and then see what that particular author is really trying to communicate about Jesus through their gospel, their version of the gospel. So, okay, does anybody have any questions about poetry or narrative? If you weren't here last week or you watched online, you had a question. Anything? Good? All right. Thanks for joining us, for joining me and everybody else. If you guys want to discuss anything, I'm here. Oh, somebody asked me about apologetics on the very first session. I can't remember who it was, though. Is anybody here? Might have been you. Okay, so I found kind of like an interesting answer, or like just like a line of thought for talking about apologetics and really the need for apologetics is, and it was presented as this like, so we all experience humanity, right? We're all human. And the human experience is that we sort of accept as our experience is based on how we answer a set of 5 questions. And basically the questions are, where are we? Who are we? What's wrong with the world? What's the solution? And what time is it? Where are we in this story right now? Is it the end, or are we somewhere in the middle, or are we just at the beginning? You know what I mean? So it's like, and where's the conflict? Has the conflict been established, or is it just now coming? And it was really interesting because through those 5 questions, like you're going to answer those 5 questions no matter what your view on the world is, whether you're an atheist or an agnostic or a Christian or a Jew or whatever it is. you have an answer to those questions. And I think it's interesting because like apologetics is this whole subject of, which actually kind of falls into this category of prose discourse too, right? Because it's an argument for something and potentially against something else. But the argument of this particular line of thought, and this is something again from Tim Mackey and the Bible Project stuff, and their opinion on it is like if you believe and you just share the story, then there's no reason to defend it. People are going to make up their own mind, but we just need to be so ingrained and in tune with what's going on in the story, and it's just a matter of which version of reality do you feel like most well defines the human experience? Is it the version that you hear in the Bible or the version that the world's telling you? Because we all have a version that we're operating from. And that doesn't mean that you can't have some conflicting points in there. There's actually a book that I have only read the intro to, but it's called, oh my gosh, I can't even think what it's called right now. Well, anyways, it's a Christian, but he's talking about battling with this inner atheist, basically. So like those like deep questions that we all have about our faith and those sorts of things are really healthy to have. But again, what narrative are we operating out of? What are the answers to these questions? It doesn't mean we can't have questions about it, but anyways. So I thought that was really cool, and I heard that come up in a podcast after you, and somebody else asked that question too. On the first one. That's kind of a new thing to me, the idea of apologetics. I was just like, I don't even know. I have to look at what that even is. And then they talked about it in a podcast. I was like, oh, that's cool. But I like the idea of these questions. These questions are going to be answered no matter what. So just plug yourself into the story and see what God speaks to you. So.
Tell me those 5 questions again.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's where are we? Who are we? What's wrong with the world? What's the solution to that problem? And then what time is it? Where are we in the story at that point? So, cool. All right. Thanks, y'all, for joining. Hope to see you next week.